Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits, a man who can generally avoid temptation unless I can't resist it. Which, if you know your quotations, is actually a line from the magnificent Mae West. And I think it's very symbolic of her position, actually, in some senses, because it's all a confection. That sentence sounds witty. It sounds wittier if you are Mae West, by the way. I don't think I was quite doing it justice. But actually, the moment you think about it, it doesn't mean anything at all. I generally avoid temptation unless I can't resist it. That would be a truism. It's a rather bland platitude. It's certainly not that witty. But if you know how to deliver it, you can get something out of it. And that's Mae West all over. And Mae West was an amazing survivor, and I think a genuine 20th century icon. Yes, she's remembered now for her quips and for being a very liberated woman at a time when women were not expected to be liberated. There's really no one quite like her in the history of the American stage or the American films, the two areas where she was most active. And it was a long career. She started in the 1930s, and her very last performance, her last film, was from 1977, when she was a spring chicken of merely 84 years old. And that film is Sextette. And if you're a long-time listener to Musical Talk, and why not if not, then you'll know that Sextette is one of those films that I keep going back to. We've discussed it a couple of times here on Musical Talk, because it's a film that keeps giving. It does have not what might be described as the best reputation from a lot of very sneery critics, and it's a very easy film to criticise. But to criticise it without enjoying it is to entirely miss the point. If you don't know Sextette, Sextette, and it represents the 6 husbands that the central character Marlowe Manners, played by Mae West, is supposed to have had, then you really ought to try and find a copy and watch it. It is available on DVD, although I think it's been discontinued in most places, so you'll probably have to look for second-hand places like eBay. And also, it is available to stream in a few areas. For 3 glorious weeks, Broadway HD, the digital theatrical streaming website, which also occasionally shows musical films, had Sextette available for members of the public to watch for a small subscription. In the UK, that period lasted, alas, only 3 weeks, but I believe it's still available in America. And I think you can also get it on Amazon Prime. It's probably worth looking around the internet to see if you can find a copy. Well, why is it a bad musical? Well, it isn't a bad musical. What it is, in fact, is not a good musical, and there's a world of difference between those phrases. But what it is a triumph. And I'm not being sarcastic, it genuinely is a triumph for Mae West. Think of this. She's an 84-year-old woman playing the central role in a film where she is a central protagonist. She's not just a character actress, she is the central character. The theme tune is all about her character. She wrote the play on which the film is based, and she was the mover and shaker that got it produced. At the end of the day, this is a very important, professional, influential and talented woman still working and taking centre stage right at the end of her life. She died 2 years later. That, particularly in the 1970s, is something to behold. And therefore, when I watch the film, and I watched it again only last night as I'm recording this, I increasingly develop a respect for Mae West as a woman and as a professional. And her life is a fascinating one. There's not time to go into it here, but she is worth reading up about if you ever get the opportunity. And the film is a comedy. A lot of the people who criticise it really seem to be expecting something like West Side Story. You're not going to get that. It's called Sextette, for goodness sake. And if you didn't spot that the central character is an 84-year-old woman with blonde hair who's marrying the very handsome young Timothy Dalton as the central dynamic of the plot, then really, you don't deserve to enjoy the film, because you won't. And you can't. You genuinely need a sense of humour. You need to appreciate that it is having a lot of fun and it's inviting you to join it. Which is not to say that it is a good musical. And there, I think, lies the problem. It's a jukebox musical for the most part. There are 2 newly written songs from 1977 placed into it, but the other songs range from everything from 1918 to the early 70s. But almost everything has been given a kind of disco beat, which does fit some songs, but it doesn't fit others, as we'll find out in just a minute. The plot is laughable, but you're not expected to take it seriously. It involves secret agents from at least 2 nations, diplomats from across the world, and a memoir which on no accounts must get into the hands of anybody apart from the person who wrote it. And of course that person who wrote it was Mae West in her character as Marlowe Manners, the world's most successful screen goddess. Now, a while ago, very nearly a decade ago in fact, I sat down with our old friend Tim Saywood and we watched Sextette and then had a rather enjoyable time discussing it for Musical Talk. So a little later in the programme we're going to hear that conversation over again, and I hope you enjoy it now in the way that a lot of people very much enjoyed it at the time. However, I think it would be remiss of me not to mention a few things which caught my attention last night. So what I'm going to do before we get into that conversation with Tim is just give you a rundown of things that struck me as a viewer of the magnificent Mae West film Sextette. Musical Talk. Now, the film starts being interesting almost immediately. We begin with the wedding of Marlowe Manners to Sir Michael Barrington. So that's Mae West marrying Timothy Dalton. This is in his pre-Bond days, even though he is playing a secret agent in this film, although that doesn't become apparent until a little later. And we can tell we're in Britain because outside a very, to my mind, American-looking church, there is a British policeman, a British bobby in his helmet. Now, obviously, that section is filmed in America. All the sections with Mae West were filmed in America. But they did have a location unit here in London, where I'm recording, and so there are lots of establishing shots. We see Marlowe and Barrington totter out of the church. It must be said that Mae West can't move very fast at this stage, and they get into a limousine, which then does a tour of London to get to the hotel where they are going to spend their wedding night. Now, it's one of those tours of London that seems to be designed purely for the tourist, because Mae West's car goes past an awful lot of famous landmarks. But if you are a Londoner, as I am, she's taking a very strange route to this hotel, which I think we have to assume is somewhere near Hyde Park. So over the opening song, which is called Marlowe, and has a wonderful lyric which is the female answer to Apollo. It also then later on rhymes tomorrow with Marlowe. It's one of those songs that you need to have an American accent to be able to sing. Marlowe, she's the female answer to Apollo, or something like that. You see the limousine reach Buckingham Palace. It then goes through Admiralty Arch to get to Trafalgar Square. So far, so good. By the way, interestingly, in the Haymarket, you can see a cinema advertising Airport 77 as the latest film. So you can tell precisely when it was filmed. And then from Trafalgar Square, she goes to Piccadilly Circus, and then to the Albert Memorial in Kensington, before presumably taking a U-turn and then returning to Parliament, because that's what we see next, as she crosses Westminster Bridge to the south side of the Thames, allowing her to drive along the South Embankment with Parliament in the background. A nice shot of Big Ben, who is referenced later in saucy terms, by the way. However, they obviously realise they're in the wrong place on the south side of the river, because the next time we see them, they're back in Trafalgar Square with Nelson's Column, and then, bizarrely, back to the Albert Memorial, and then finally back to Buckingham Palace. It's almost as though they've completely retraced their steps to where the church supposedly was. And then finally we reach the hotel in which most of the action takes place. And you can tell that that part is filmed in America, because first of all you see Mae West, and secondly, all the street signs are suddenly on the wrong side of the road, as well as a few Cadillacs and broad American cars of the 1970s travelling up the road. I'm making fun of it, of course, but it is hilarious. And it's endemic of any film, particularly Hollywood films, I must say, that want to give you a travelogue to prove that they're in the area they say they are. And then there's a nice little throwaway joke. The place is full of reporters, this hotel, waiting for Marlowe to arrive. And the American news networks have hired an American sports commentator to give a rundown of how the bridal suite is going to operate. I quite like the idea that they've used a sports commentator for bedroom antics. Then we get on to the next song, which is an absolute classic song from Mae West's early career. Not that she sang it. It's the famous Hooray for Hollywood, which comes from 1937 and an American film called Hollywood Hotel. So there is an irony going on here that we're in a hotel full of reporters waiting for the Hollywood film star, which is not in itself a Hollywood hotel, but as near as damn it in London, and they all sing Hooray for Hollywood. And if you're really attuned to popular music, you'll notice that the arranger has actually been quite clever, because he's interweaved the melody of You Stepped Out of a Dream into it. although it's a very curious rendition of the piece, and we will discuss it later in the conversation with Tim. But actually, the chorus only ever sing "Hooray for Hollywood." None of the other lyrics, the fantastic lyrics by Johnny Mercer, get anywhere near anyone's mouths. Now, bearing in mind that Timothy Dalton is the main male role, it takes 11 minutes for him to say anything. And to be honest, he is the Hollywood ideal of a typical Englishman. He wears a morning suit for the entire film. He's a knight of the realm. He is Sir Michael Barrington. And not only that, and to prove absolutely beyond doubt that he's British, he spends a lot of time on his introductory scene humming Rule Britannia. Incidentally written in 1740 by Thomas Arne, fact fans. That is, of course, the oldest song in the film. And then there is a whole spate of really fabulous throwaway jokes. Ringo Starr puts in a magnificent performance as a mad film director who's supposed to be incredibly influenced by Lubitsch and has been described as son of Lubitsch, or as Marlowe Manners puts it, at least I think that's what they said. And then later on, we're told that Marlowe's next film is going to be called Catherine Was Great, which is straight out of the Kenny Everett School of Films for Cupid's Stunt. But it very quickly becomes apparent that although Timothy Dalton and Marlowe Manners are the principal characters, the actual dynamic of the film is Mae West and Dom DeLuise, who plays her personal assistant. And the lovely thing about their performances, they look like A, they're having fun, and B, they look like they're friends. I don't know if they were, but it really does look like two mates having a whale of a time on a film set. And I think Dom DeLuise is really the standout performance in the entire film. And it's not a cameo. He is in it for the whole piece. Now, we're about to reach our third song, 23 minutes in, as the entire American athletics team arrives in the hotel for no obvious reason. We learnt that it was the Olympics the year before, which would have been 1976, factually accurate, but it's difficult to work out precisely why they've checked into a hotel in London, where they are going to be doing training. They train in the public park outside and in the basement gym of this hotel for whatever tournament was taking place presumably in 1977, the year of the Queen's Silver Jubilee. Now, they'll get a song a little bit later, but almost immediately after we see them check in, Timothy Dalton presents us with what can only now be described as a good example of that long line of James Bond actors having a go at a song and not quite managing it. Of course, one's memory is immediately pulled towards the memory of Sir Roger Moore joining the cast of Aspects of Love and then leaving the production before the opening night. And of course, the best example of all, Pierce Brosnan warbling, not quite singing, his way through two Mamma Mia films. But in this film, Sextette, we are treated to Timothy Dalton, Sprechsanging in the best Rex Harrison traditions, the fantastic 1973 Neil Sedaka song, Love Will Keep Us Together. I think it's fair to say that Timothy Dalton is not altogether comfortable singing, and I think it's also fair to say that the audience is not altogether comfortable with Timothy Dalton singing. But interestingly, you do get the song sung in a totally British style. He does not in any way sing any of the American inflections. He sings it with his British accent, and what it does do, funnily enough, is give the song a different dimension to what you might expect. It is at least an absolutely original interpretation of a well-known song. And there's much fun to be had along the way. The middle eight has an opening lyric about being young and beautiful, which Timothy Dalton has to sing to the 84-year-old Mae West, who he's just married. Now, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Age perhaps is less so. And then, if that wasn't ripe enough, at 28 minutes in, we get Keith Moon playing a Hollywood dress designer who gate crashes the wedding night and the bridal suite in order to make sure that Marlowe is trying on a few costumes for her forthcoming film, Catherine is Great. And in a film where everybody is given what can only be described as a heightened performance, I think Keith Moon takes the biscuit for chewing the scenery. Although it's a highly enjoyable scene, and you do want to see more of him, funnily enough. And if you're after a bit of trivia, he sort of turns into a pirate halfway through and gives us his best Long John Silver, Robert Newton impression. But he does have at least the good grace of doing it whilst Marlowe is wearing a gold dress, so there is some kind of logic to that. 37 minutes in, it's time for Dom DeLuise to sing his song, and he has a crack at the 1968 Beatles classic Honey Pie, which is about Marlowe, of course, at least in the context of the film, because it is about a film star who's gone over the ocean. In the original song, of course, it's about a British star who's gone to America and made it big there, whilst her lover pines in the original country. In Sextette, Dom DeLuise has revealed himself to be secretly in love with Marlowe, and therefore is trying to get her back away from Britain to America, where he can control her life. Now, watching Dom DeLuise in a top hat trying to tap dance on top of a glass piano in a bridal suite in front of a cardboard cutout of Marlowe Manners, alias Mae West, is something I won't easily forget, but I must say I enjoyed it. And I particularly like the very end, where he sort of actually morphs into Mae West as he walks out of shot. But the film's not going to slow down anywhere after that. We next meet Tony Curtis, who's one of Mae West's former husbands in the piece. He contrives to have another romantic dinner with her, and you get this fantastic scene with candlelight and promised violins where he pours out 2 glasses of champagne for him and for her, you think, and then he drinks them both in front of her. Now, that dinner date with Sexy Lexi, the Tony Curtis character, comes to an end quite quickly at 46 minutes into the film, which is about halfway through. And Mae West takes her leave of Tony Curtis by singing the song After You've Gone, originally written in 1918, which is the end of the First World War, remember, and was composed by a man called Turner Layton, who interestingly died in 1978. So it's very possible he could have seen this film in cinemas in 1977 and seen his song After You've Gone, it must be said, murdered, I'm sorry to say, because Mae West sings it to a disco beat and it's not a comfortable fit. And she also sings it in the first person, so it's renamed After I've Gone. And just to rub in the bodily harm that's being done to this classic song, the second verse is a mere repeat, but it's done at twice the pace. And then a mere 3 minutes later, we get another song, or at least a reference to a famous Fats Waller number called All That Meat and No Potatoes. And it's interesting that Mae West quotes it when standing in front of a number of the American athletic team who were wearing nothing but lycra pants in front of her. It does give it a second meaning. And then very soon after that, she sings a song called Happy Birthday 21, which is originally Neil Sedaka's Happy Birthday Sweet 16. Now, I didn't know this. That number was originally written by Neil Sedaka in 1961 about being 16. But in 1972, 5 years before this film, Mae West recorded an album. And on that album, she asked the British songwriter Ian Whitcomb to write new lyrics for being 21. The idea being that she wanted a song she could sing to her fans when they came of age. And in America, 21 is when you can start to drink. So it's a song that had been around in this modern form for Mae West, specifically for Mae West, since 1972, for 5 years. And then that version was the one that was interpolated into the film Sextette, when she sings it to one of the American athletics team who's just turned 21. It's time for a brief interlude with 2 former husbands of Mae West. At 53 minutes in, Ringo Starr comes in a very wobbly accent, which is sometimes Liverpudlian and sometimes not, as the mad film director, dressed actually in jodhpurs and carrying a whip, unbelievably. And that's a scene that's done with real gusto. And there's a throwaway line which I absolutely buy into. Ringo Starr criticises one of the cast of the film he's making at the moment for being a bad actor, and uses the immortal phrase, he acts like an opera singer, which I'm afraid to say my limited experience of opera proves. They're great singers, my word, they can't act. And then hot on his heels, we get George Hamilton playing the 5th husband of Mae West, who's a mafia character. And quite unbelievably, we get an incredibly stupid scene, although very funny, where he meets a mafia don godfather, who he fears he's upset, and he just reels off a string of totally unrelated Italian words, as though they were an Italian conversation. It's full of cappuccino, mozzarella, things like that. Then it's time to raid the vaults of popular music again, with a song from 1926, when once again, to a disco beat, Mae West treats us to Babyface. You've got the cutest little baby face, which unbelievably she sings to the United Nations who are meeting in her hotel. And the delegates, being polite gentlemen, everyone, sing the backing track back to her. Now, it's interesting, I think, to note that Babyface was going through a bit of a revival because it had just been used in 1967, a mere 10 years beforehand, in the film of Thoroughly Modern Millie. So it is one of those classic numbers that was known. 2 minutes later, we get a song sung by Alice Cooper. I know, the contrasts in this film are quite remarkable. It's one of the very few new songs written for the piece. It's called Next, Next, He Blew His Chance With You. And I think the most striking thing about this song, apart from the fact there are choreographed bellboys and housemaids dancing as Alice Cooper sings this number, is the fact that he sits down at the aforementioned glass piano, and when he presses a few notes, it doesn't sound like a piano. It seems to be a piano that can play the entire orchestra. At 1 hour and 20 minutes into the piece, you can see Marlowe Manners making, I think, what is a cardinal mistake when trying to leave the building by a lift. Now, it's certainly true that in Britain we operate our floor numbering system differently to the way that people in America do. We have a ground floor, and therefore our ground floor is the floor on which you enter, and the floor above it is the first. In America, you enter on the first floor normally, and then go up to the second floor. However, this hotel clearly has 8 floors, however you number them, and if you're trying to leave the building, you're either going to press the bottom button or the second from bottom button if there's a basement. For some reason, when she's trying to leave the building, Marlowe Manors presses the 4th button up from the bottom. That must mean that this building has got 3 basements. And then 1 minute after that, you can start to tell that we're reaching the end of the film because we get a reprise as a very sad Timothy Dalton on his private yacht, thinking that his relationship is already over with Marlowe Manors, sings a downbeat version of Love Will Keep Us Together. But of course, everything turns out right in the end, with an incredibly filthy double entendre from Mae West, which tells us the entire film has ended happily, indeed with a proper happy ending, it may be said, using both meanings of that phrase. And then we finish with a reprise of the song Marlowe, remember, the female answer to Apollo, and some magnificent footage of the yacht going down the Thames, and a lot of double entendre and suggestion in some of the scenery that we're seeing at the same time. So bearing in mind that we're expected to believe that the nuptials are taking place at last between Timothy Dalton and Mae West on his yacht, we see a cannon fire, we see a hose ship firing its water jets, and we see the gun emplacements on the HMS Belfast rising. We also see Tower Bridge raising its bascules as finally we see the yacht disappearing up towards Greenwich. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is just a series of my happy observations about this very wonderful film, Sextette. Now, of course, I've just been pointing out one or two of the things that caught my fancy last night when I watched the film again. But I stand by my guns, raised or otherwise. I think the film is a triumph for Mae West. And I repeat that the people who don't like the film and criticise it for being a bad film and a bad musical, I think have rather missed the point. However, as promised earlier, I think now's the time to revisit a conversation I had in depth with Tim Sayward about this triumphant, magnificent Mae West musical film from 1977. So, as I've had reason to say before, strap yourselves into your most comfortable restraining device, superglue your headphones to some or all of your head orifices, and knock back a couple of aspirin and a vodka as you listen to Tim Sayward and me talking about 1977's strange musical, Sextette. Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast.
Welcome to Musical Talk. My name is Mae West. I'm the girl who works for Paramount in the day and Fox all night. Actually, I'm Tim Sayward, but I'm sure you were fooled as I introduced this episode. This episode of Musical Talk, welcome to that, by the way, is about a very unusual musical. Quite some time ago, some years now, in fact, ago, Thos and I, Thos is here, hello Thos.
Hello Tim, or May as I may call you.
Exactly, we did an episode, of course it's very interesting about Mae West, she went west, didn't she, as we're about to discover. We did an episode a while ago about the 5,000 Fingers of Dr. Teal, we did an item on it, which I think at the time I described as probably one of the worst musicals I'd ever seen.
But fun.
But fun, but very fun to watch and very camp and nonsensical. However, there is another contender for this crown because we've recently watched, not for the first time, I have to say, the marvellous Sextette, which is a 1978 film starring and also written by Mae West, who at the time was
84.
Was 84. Wow. Okay. But she still plays the romantic lead in it, doesn't she?
I think romantic lead is polite. Sex kitten.
Yes.
Quite a big kitten.
So I think you're beginning to see, listeners, what the first sort of general error that was made by the production team was that they cast Mae West aged 84 as the sex kitten of the thing. It's an adaptation of a play that she actually wrote,
which did appear on Broadway.
And it's a bit of a runaround, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you can imagine it being done on stage, actually, as a sort of very conventional Broadway comedy, basically, comedy play. But they decided, let's scale this up for reasons best known to themselves.
Profit.
Oh, that was it. And make a big musical out of this, but let's use some existing songs and Well, where should we start with
Well,
Sextette?
it is certainly an example of a jukebox musical.
Yes, okay. It's true.
But let us start with the opening theme tune. Would you care to read out some of the lyrics? It's a specially written song.
Yes.
It's one of the few specially written songs for the piece.
A specially written song. So it goes, Marlowe, the female answer to Apollo, as lovely as Venus de Milo, or Milo, I'm not sure. A living dream, Marlowe, you are the promise of tomorrow, for you are the rainbow that we follow across the silver screen.
Now, Marlowe is the name of the character. She plays Marlowe Manners, does Mae West. And as Tim has beautifully intoned from the delightful lyrics, there's a rather... bearing in mind she's 84, she's identified as the promise of tomorrow.
The promise of what tomorrow, they don't say, but...
But in a way, that sums up the film overall, because it is a good example of optimism over practicality.
Now, one of the things that's particularly remarkable about this, as with many flops or cult musicals, feature people like Rocky Horror, for example, feature people who weren't particularly well known at the time the film was made because they couldn't really get massive names, at the time. And so Tim Curry became famous with Rocky Horror rather than being famous at the time that it was made, I think it's fair to say. But this one is crammed full of stars who certainly already were quite well known. Timothy Dalton, perhaps least of all, actually, who had, however, performed with the RSC by this time and was established. Obviously, he hadn't been.
But that says immediately Royal Shakespeare Company.
Yes,
good British actor,
solid British,
solid.
Yes, Dom DeLuise, a comic performer, and this is where we start getting into the big stars. Tony Curtis is in it, obviously famous, of course, not least for Some Like It Hot. Ringo Starr, famous, of course, as the drummer of the Beatles. Not only him, but also Keith Moon, who was the drummer for The Who. Both appear in quite remarkable cameos, I think it's fair to say. We've got George Hamilton, Van McCoy, Walter Pidgeon, a veteran actor by this time and certainly extremely famous.
And often playing British-style characters. He was a husband in Mrs. Miniver, which is a good wartime morale-boosting piece.
Yep.
So this is his last film.
We've got George Raft, who shows up for a very brief cameo indeed.
Also his last film.
Indeed. And then, perhaps most bizarrely of all, another pop performer or rock performer is Alice Cooper, who, this must be the only time when he crosses over with the world line of Mae West. By this time, for 10 years already, he'd been he'd basically invented sort of goth rock, really, basically, and or heavy metal. But he pops in to do, a Bernie Taupin number during this.
Yes, it's very
plays a bellboy.
It's non-characteristic, isn't it, for him?
Yes, it's very pushing against typecasting.
We should talk very briefly about George Raft, actually, because, as you say, George Raft has a tiny little cameo in it, and he's a very famous American actor.
As himself, pretty much, isn't he?
Well, he does, yeah. But it's a return favour. Because George Raft employed Mae West in her first film in 1932. It was called Night After Night.
Right.
She had this tiny little role, and she didn't really like it. She didn't think it was... because she was already a star on stage.
Yeah.
But she thought that she could do rather better. So she didn't really like the role she'd been cast in. But George Raft then said, well, you can rewrite the words that you've got to say to suit your character. Okay. And because she was a writer. The thing about Mae West is that actually she was a very accomplished writer of screenplays and shows. She's a very, very accomplished woman, particularly for the 20s and 30s. When you weren't given that opportunity, she sort of broke the boundaries. She's quite important in that sense, and we might touch on that in a minute.
Parker,
So she wrote her own words. And, of course, this is her famous aphorism, and there's so many, but her first one... She wrote herself in this scene where a hat-check girl exclaims, "Goodness, what beautiful diamonds," to Mae West, in which response she gets, "Goodness had nothing to do with it, dearie."
Which is a famous line, isn't it?
And it's hers, and she invented it. And George Raft later said she stole everything but the cameras, which is pretty fair. But it's rather nice circularity that both Mae West and George Raft's last film return the favour that he gave her in the first place. I think it's rather nice.
But this isn't why this film is famous, is it?
That is not why
why Sextette is famous is because it has a ludicrous plot. It has some of the worst landing songs in the history of musicals.
It's a musical, which is why we're interested.
Yes, and many of these songs just sort of pop up really in random sort of intervals. So let's take a couple of examples. I think probably the most famous one is "Love Will Keep Us Together," which was a Neil Sedaka song, popular in the 70s. Not terribly popular now.
It's popular with me.
Oh, well, okay, fine. Well, not my kind of thing.
It's popular with my father, and he's in his 70s.
But if you Google YouTube, Timothy Dalton, Mae West, the chances are you will come up with and this rendition of "Love Will Keep Us Together."
Would you care to describe it?
Stilted, I think, is how I describe it on the part of Timothy Dalton, and actually on the part of Mae West as well.
But the narrative is that that he and she have just married that day.
Yes, that's
he
right.
is Sir Michael Barrington.
Yes, a very senior.
He's 32,
toff, basically. Yes,
she's 84. She
Yes.
is 52 years older than her bride.
they don't really make much of that, do they? But yes,
I don't think they'll make much of anything, to be honest.
No.
But the whole, it's a farce.
Yeah.
The whole piece is really about, will he ever get her to bed? Will she ever get him to bed?
Yeah.
Because she keeps being sort of pulled away for other events, and he keeps being pulled away deliberately in order to give her a chance to go off and do these other bits and pieces, include save the world.
exactly. Yes,
But on these rare occasions when they do meet up in their lounge, in their bedroom, they're in the bridal suite,
yes,
in a room with a double bed shaped like a gold swan.
yes, indeed.
They do occasionally, they are supposed to be genuinely in love. It's not a sham marriage. And he, she's saying, I'll never get to see you. I never get to spend any time with you. And he starts
Yes.
to intone, speaking.
Yes,
Love.
love will keep us together.
Yeah.
Think of me, babe, whenever some sweet guy comes along singing his song, and then the backing track kicks in like at an
Lurches
immense
in.
speed at that time.
It's a real lurch. isn't it?
Stop, says she, meaning it, I think, at that point. And the other lovely thing is that Mae West, at 84, she's not much of a mover at that stage. I mean, there's this massive Hollywood, in fact, it's hooray for Hollywood, quite early on.
Yes.
Somebody, and the cue for this, by the way, is that she's obviously a Hollywood star. That's the entire relevance of the song. She turns up, and then some random person shouts, "Hooray for Hollywood!"
And then
And then they all launch into it, all of the men from the hotel,
except Mae West.
except Mae West.
As you say, it's in a huge lobby.
And they
all
all
the bellboys
all the
perform.
bellboys do a sort of Hello Dolly style routine where they swirl around
On the
her
stairs.
and laud her and magnify
Well,
her.
she sort of staggers off very slowly.
And she does. She moves very slowly across the screen on what look like two fairly dodgy hips,
But what's rather...
and disappears stage right.
But the thing about
Stage left.
this Hooray for Hollywood
Yeah.
is that it's a famous song from the 30s.
Yes.
What you don't get is any of the lyrics.
No. They go,
Except for
"Hooray for
Hollywood."
Hollywood!" Na
And
na
then
na
nothing
na
else.
na 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 na.
And then occasionally, again, when that bit comes up, they then shout "Hooray for Hollywood" again.
Yes.
So it's not really a song; it's done as an incidental piece. But as you say, it's a big Busby Berkeley kind of choreographed number.
It all
And
means nothing
the
at all.
bellboys are doing tap dancing
Yes.
on the stairs.
Yes.
The stairs which are carpeted.
Oh. Some set designer must have got fired for that one, although presumably, I don't know, really.
Yeah, I don't think so. No, not
was-
at all. But it's interesting.
Possibly argue like firing the cleaners on the Titanic, I suppose.
I like that.
Water everywhere here. You're
Mop
fired.
this up. Yeah, no, seriously. So you've got, but it's a very impressive piece. Bizarrely, it's awful because you suddenly think this
Yeah.
is remarkably cheesy, and yet at the same time they are all putting in their worth in the dancing.
So that's Hooray for Hollywood and its limited relevance. Now, before we go on to discuss some of the other things, we should probably just sort of talk about the general plot and who else is in the hotel at this time, because this is kind
It's a
of relevant.
commercial hotel. It's a a hotel off the
yeah.
street. It's supposed to be one of Britain's
Top
grandest
hotels,
hotels.
yes. There's an international peace conference going on featuring world leaders from pretty much every nation that Hollywood can come up with a costume for.
Including Jimmy Carter, then President of America.
Yes, it's someone who looks very like Jimmy Carter indeed. And there's...
And that's chaired by Walter Pidgeon, who's the British, even though he's an American actor, he plays
Yes.
the British chairman of this authority.
That's right. We've got... for various reasons that I don't think we ever really discover, Marlowe's previous husbands, at least number 3, 4 and 5, I'm not sure if any of the others, the first two turn up, but
We're all in the building.
But those we've got, there's Tony Curtis, who is actually a Russian diplomat known as Sexy Alexei. There's Ringo Starr playing...
Well, he's a film director. He's
A film
a
director,
he's a film director, and one of the reasons it's briefly touched on that Marlowe isn't being able to give all her time to her new husband is the fact that for some reason or other she's about to start
Screen
filming.
test, that's right,
Yeah, she's
for
going to be
film.
filming a new film shortly, and
Directed by this former husband, Ringo
The
Starr.
studio have demanded that she does a screen test and a costume fitting. It should
That's
be
right,
said.
yes.
That afternoon, even though it's her wedding afternoon.
Yes, weird.
Anyway, so that's why Timothy Dalton's character has to be kept away.
That's right, so
that's
there's
Ringo
that.
Starr's character. He's doing the screen test with
We've got
her.
the Keith Moon character, who's...
dresser, he's the
He's the
dresser.
dresser, so he does the costume fitting. He's another former husband, isn't he? Oh, I'm not sure.
I didn't get that
Okay.
impression. He was
Oh, yeah,
he
fine.
was playing a very gay man.
Then we have... That's true, actually. And then we have a an Italian gangster, basically, who is her immediately previous husband, who it turns out wasn't dead as she had believed, but in fact...
With hilarious complications.
With hilarious consequences, yes, exactly. And then this new British husband that she's got, who also turns out, in another brilliant twist, to be working secretly for the civil service and actually...
Secret service.
Yes, sorry, what did I say?
Civil service.
Oh, yes, working secretly for the civil service. Well, we all actually...
He's a spy. He's a British spy.
He's a British spy, hence, of course, he later played James Bond, didn't he?
Yeah. And indeed 007 is mentioned in an immortal line about... can I just quickly give you the line?
Yes.
Right towards the end, Sir Michael Barrington is described by the Dom DeLuise character as bigger than 007, leaving Marlowe to say, I never got a chance to take his measurements. Yes.
Anyway.
As thrilling as it sounds.
So, and all of this peace conference will collapse, it is intimated, if Marlowe Manners' cassette autobiography or memoirs fall into the hands of the conference, because they'll all realise that she slept with every last man jack of them.
On behalf of America.
On behalf of America,
because the CIA
she was working for the CIA herself, that's right.
She keeps them all sweet.
I hope you're following this at home.
Well, they're not the only visitors to the hotel, are they?
No.
Because there's also, as if all of that weren't enough, there's also an Olympic team of some kind, athletics team. Yeah, they're American. They seem to be all sports.
Yes.
Because they've got a javelin, a trampoline,
all kinds of things.
And the most amazing haircuts.
Yes.
But we'll talk about them in a minute.
Well, let's talk about them now, actually.
All right, let's talk about them now.
Because now we've set all that up, we can talk safely about this scene. So, Marlowe Manners, in pursuit of this cassette that's gone missing that is a threat to world peace, a lovely pink cassette that she records.
At one stage baked in a cake, but escapes from the cake, gets thrown onto it ends up on a javelin.
Yes, thrown by one of the sports team, and then the next time we see it, the javelin guy is sitting on the edge of the trampoline with his javelin sticking over his shoulder very dangerously,
whilst the man's jumping on the trampoline,
and it falls off onto the trampoline.
That's the cassette. Yeah.
Marlowe arrives. There's a big sort of very camp number, Happy Birthday 21, adapted from Happy Birthday Sweet 16, which she sings for no readily apparent reason to the youngest member of the team, basically, who has an extremely unfortunate late 70s hairdo.
Yeah, he'd be very attractive if he wasn't covered in a haystack.
Exactly, yeah. Yes, it's sort of... I mean, if you imagine Matthew Broderick in Torch Song Trilogy and, multiply that by 7.
With the same hairdresser that Divine has in Hairspray.
Yes, that's right, yes, that sort of a thing. So, yes, she hymns him, and they all hymn her, and as it were, and him and hers. Then the trampolinist jumps up and down a couple of times, and the cassette, which is up to this point has been sitting perfectly happily on the trampoline, just bouncing up and down a little bit,
yeah.
is catapulted
in defiance of all gravity
70 metres into the air and carefully lands in the mouth of a stone lion.
A gargoyle, basically, on the side of the hotel's higher regions. But let's just talk about the song.
Yes.
Happy Birthday, Sweet 16.
20 or 21 in this case, yes.
Another Neil Sedaka number again. Apparently, the reason it was changed from 16 to 21 is because I just sit for a second and enjoy the thinking behind this. Mm-hmm. It was thought inappropriate for the 84-year-old Mae West to be singing a song of a faintly romantic or sexual nature to a 16-year-old,
right? But
perfectly fine.
Oh, well, that's fine.
If he was 21.
Yes.
The problem is it does require new lyrics, and so new lyrics were provided, or some changes were made to the lyrics.
Yes, there are assorted ones where she says, in fact, when you were Sweet 16, you were just a little boy, or whatever. I don't know what it actually says, but, But now you're 21.
But the new lyrics were by somebody called Ian Whitcomb.
Ah.
Now, Ian Whitcomb had one hit in the 1960s as a pop singer, but then immediately went into classic music hall and vaudeville numbers. He's a British singer and performer. Yeah. He does a lot of work with banjoleles and novelty numbers from the 1920s.
God someone's doing that.
And so he was called in to rewrite the lyrics in order to make them more appropriate for a 21-year-old. Okay. But we'll be speaking more about Ian Whitcomb.
With him.
We'll be speaking later. We'll be speaking a little more of Ian Whitcomb later in the programme, because he does come up in Mae West story again.
Okay, all right, we'll come back to him. Should we talk about...
Can I just make one further observation for something? These are all trailers for later in the programme. The other thing about the gymnastics team is that actually half the men are in no way gymnasts. They spend a lot of their time taking off their tops. Several people stand by. They're muscle men. And indeed, if you read the closing credits, they are all Mr. Universes and Mr. Pennsylvania.
Okay.
So they're not genuine sportsmen in a physical sense. They're posing, which is exactly the Mae West thing.
Yes, exactly. Up to my neck and muscle.
And will be all that meat and no potatoes was also stated.
That's right, yes.
But which is a song by Thomas Fats Waller, by the way, from the 1930s.
Okay,
but we'll be talking about muscle men in Mae West's life later on as well.
Well, you said that, fat swallow, it just suddenly sounded different to me.
A fat swallow.
Yeah. Anyway.
As opposed to a huge
I've
turkey,
been primed
which is what
by
we've been
this.
talking about.
Exactly. So, do we know... So hopefully we've given a slight flavour of the thing. I mean, obviously we'll talk more about the content and some of the other songs and why they're all utterly disastrous a bit later on. But that's roughly what it is. It's a run-around comedy that's had some musical numbers chosen pretty much at random and jammed any which way into it, with an 84-year-old star. Why did this happen? Do we know anything about the production history of this, such that we can understand why?
Not obviously.
Okay.
It's very... I mean, let's talk... I mean, the film itself was received very badly and was a big flop at the box office. But
fair enough.
There was a huge cult of Mae West developing.
Right.
And clearly somebody thought they might be able to cash in on that. So what was bizarre was, although it was a huge failure, the Mae West fans came out in droves for it. And a lot of them were young people.
Yeah.
You know, rediscovering the camp. Because by the 60s and 70s, a lot of... speech marks, straight stars of the past,
yes,
were reinterpreted in a camp way. Indeed, as is in Stephen Sondheim's "I'm Still Here." That's it happens to the central character in that. And Batman had all occurred only 10, 15 years ago. So we're still in that phase. So I think that they're she's a true icon,
yes,
of the 30s, and of course, significantly, she was a very early feminist in some senses. She was writing her own stuff. She was talking overtly about sex, straight sex and gay sex. She didn't have any truck with racial discrimination in America.
No, yeah, she was very modern.
There's a fantastic story later on, quite late in her life. She had an amorous fling with a black American bodybuilder.
Yeah,
and they went to a hotel together, and there was discrimination against him.
Oh, right. Okay.
So she resolved the situation then and there by buying the building.
Wow,
that's a certain kind of class. But it's talk about putting your money where your mouth is.
Yes, absolutely.
But that's entirely to be recommended. She's oddly very profoundly liberal.
Yes, well, yeah, I guess that's not too surprising. She plays up the southern thing, as you say, but it's not at all, typical of some of her era from that particular place.
But as to what it looked like, because it's a cheap film, it looks like a cheap buck film.
Yes.
Someone said, let's get Mae West in, it'll be a hoot, it'll become a cult classic.
And then exactly, we'll choose...
And then we'll coin it in, but they didn't.
Some big stars as well to be in it. Do we know if it made its money back, or presumably not, I'm guessing?
I don't know the details. It's there's not that much about it online, so it's quite difficult to research.
She does use it as an opportunity to sort of restate a lot of her sort of well-known lines, doesn't she?
Well, she's the queen of the aphorism, isn't she? The one-liner, the epigram. She's the Oscar Wilde, if you like, but sexually and female.
Yes.
Yes, and so many of the lines are her original lines from her films in the 30s.
Yes, exactly.
She doesn't actually say, come up and see me sometime.
No, but yes, exactly. But there's not the men in my life, but the life in my men.
Yes.
And there's assorted other sort of well-known things that she's famous for saying.
Here's just a selection of some of the things she says. The reporter says to her at the beginning, just as she enters the hotel, "How do you like it in London, Marlowe?" To which she replies, "I like it anywhere."
She says, "Marriage is like a book. The whole story takes place between the covers."
And you've already opened with the extremely rude line about working for Paramount and Fox.
Yes, indeed, yes.
Apparently, that was from a scene they had to tone down for the film, so one wonders what...
Hard to imagine what they could have said that was more explicit than that, but there we are.
And then there's a very funny thing about... the Ringo Starr's character is called Lubitsch.
But I forgave him everything. He was such a wonderful director, very much like Lubitsch. In fact, they call him Son of Lubitsch. At least that's what it sounded like.
And there's a lovely line later on when she's being threatened by the gangster husband number 5, and he knocks on the door, and her sort of assistant, who's the Dom DeLuise character, he says, "Who's that?" And she says, "Well, it ain't opportunity."
And yet somehow this is all to no effect whatsoever.
Well, yes, I mean, it's odd. It's a bad film, but it's a good bad film. It's not. It's not a dull film.
No.
You can get a lot out of it if you choose to, and we did.
Yes, indeed.
But something you observed when we were watching it, actually, was the sound mixing.
Yes.
You might like to comment
Very
on that.
poor.
It's cool.
So we talked already about the fact that the way that the accompanying, normally when you do a musical, the way, and I'd assume in this case that may well have been how it was done. You have you pre-record the accompanying tracks. You may pre-record the actual. In fact, you would pre-record the vocal track as well. Yes, in fact. So you basically have got those things there before you even start filming the actual scenes, and then in the scenes they play back the what you're going to be singing along to, and the character, the actor, mimes to that.
Yeah, lip syncs.
Lip syncs to it, exactly. And then they, it all is beautifully sewn together, and a brand new sort of ambient soundtrack is put together, a Foley edit, as they call it, and there's your song basically, and it should, in theory, if you get it right, it should flow seamlessly from the ambient noise that you've got in the scene where you record the dialogue, and what you actually say on the set is what you hear, to the bit where you slip into the pre-recorded stuff. And it certainly is a feature of a lot of musicals, actually, particularly older ones. You notice there is a bit of a difference. They're much closer to the mic when they're singing and stuff like that. It seems a little bit unrealistic. You definitely get that in 5,000 Things of Dr. T, actually, quite a lot as well. And here, it's amazing. It's like the last 50 years of musical theatre
rolled back.
Yeah, musical filmmaking, rather, have never been learned, because the tracks are really poppy style tracks anyway, which are
disco. It's 78. It's 1978.
It is,
and they're
disco arrangements,
yeah,
exactly.
They absolutely are.
With mainly live instruments, but also some sort of electronic. I think I may be wrong about that, but there's no middle missing from them, so that there's room for a vocalist, and therefore, in order for you to hear the vocal, they have to turn the vocal up very high and the track down very low, with the result that there's no sort of energy coming from the track, because it's sort of chunkering away there, but it's very quiet.
It's a bed rather than a support.
So yes, as it were, as Mae West herself probably might have said at the time. So it's enormously unsuccessful. And not only that, but of course they then have the problem with that none of the introductions work in that traditional musical theatre way. Cole Porter was very good at it, wasn't he? There's 4 sort of lines done ad-lib speed, where you sort of get into the thing, or like in Sign, for example, in Annie's a good example of a good favourite song of mine. You ever been to Buenos Aires? A hunger for the Argentine, but before you get into the rhythmic part, there's a little bit, I make a very dry martini, pause,
and
just
off we go.
And then you gradually get into the song.
There's an easement from dialogue to
But the
song.
only time they attempt it completely sort of fails, really. It's like someone starting up a motorcycle and it going off at twice the speed you expected it to.
Which is the Love Will Keep Us Together masterpiece.
And half of the rest of the time they don't even bother with that, really. So, for example, Babyface, which is which Mae West sings to all of the delegates in the thing.
Peace conference.
She, first of all, crowbars the song in by just sort of bridging. So she starts by saying, you all love me, and remember what it is that made you fall in love with me in the first place. And that is the cue for her to sing, it was my baby face. I think she didn't even do it that elegantly. I think she just starts, baby face.
Which, ironically, she doesn't have, because she's obviously had a few lifts.
She's 84.
Yes.
She has a maybe face at that stage.
Very good.
It's fair to say.
But it's also, regrettably, the song where you can see the lip syncing failing more than anywhere else. Actually.
Exactly.
You can see her waiting for... She's waiting for the pre-record to catch up with where she is.
Yes.
So there's a slightly awkward...
I get the impression that maybe they did record some of those vocals live on set then, actually, and then they had to sort of mix all that together. I don't know. That would be an interesting thing to go into in another occasion when we're being a bit geekier than we are today. But there's Mae West.
As you say, she does sing it to the delegates of the essentially the United Nations for no obvious reason, and it all seems to pacify them. They for no reason or other have found world peace.
Yeah.
But it's all about to be thrown away, because they then decide to have what I think is known as a potluck party, where for some reason or other they all bring their national dish to the table.
That's right, yes.
And obviously everyone gets deeply offended because they discover they're eating frog's legs or pork, and they're not allowed to.
Well, there's an Israeli, I assume, delegate who is terribly offended because a sheikh has offered him pork. But you know what?
This would be an Arab
Muslims
sheikh.
also don't eat pork.
Yes, not a researched piece.
No,
I think.
I don't think so.
Yes, they threw all the truth away in that moment.
They did.
Anyway, so she comes in and saves the conference by singing Babyface to them.
Yes, and it works, doesn't it? They just cut away from that scene, and we assume that that's won everybody over. They don't really go into how, but whatever. I mean, who cares?
And that, I think,
power of comedy.
Pretty much the last we see of the delegates.
It is actually. That sort of stops then at that point.
There's their story.
So the Third World War is averted. Should you ever need you at home to avert the Third World War, the best method is to sing Babyface at as many international leaders as you can get into one room. That's what I recommend. And then swivel off on your old hips that barely work.
But should we talk about what's really good about the piece?
No.
No, we should, because actually, although poor old Mae is struggling, she can't walk very fast.
Yes.
She's relying a little bit on fairly tired material. She is actually surrounded by... One or two of the cameos are quite poor. George Hamilton, I'm sorry to say, is rubbish.
Yes.
But actually, Dom DeLuise, we both agreed, really worked wonders with the thin material he was given, and it's all he's doing eye performances and action and reaction shots, and he's retired. He's a valet.
This is a man who belongs in Mel Brooks films, really, and would have done marvellous things in them, but unfortunately, he was in this one instead.
Yes, but he puts in a really good performance. And Ringo Starr's cameo is actually very effective because he's going for it, as is Keith Moon.
It's not bad.
They're not subtle. It's not subtle.
It's not subtle, but I mean, I suppose the other thing with Ringo Starr's he does act, certainly, and he certainly doesn't, fail to act.
There was one failing, wasn't there?
Yes, there was one significant failing, which of course is that Lubitsch, I assume he's meant to be the Russian or...
he's German or Russian.
Some sort of Polish, perhaps, I don't know. Yes, he speaks with a... Well,
he's European in some way.
But in fact speaks with a regular Scouse accent.
Well, it keeps coming out, doesn't it?
Well, he keeps it up for about the first 2 lines that he does in the film, and then pretty much the rest of it is largely Scouse. Thanks very much, Ringo. Off you go and do Thomas the Tank Engine instead. That's your future.
But I'm not going to hear the criticism, because actually I think he's pitched it exactly right for the film. He's at the level of energy required, as is Keith Moon, playing a gay dresser.
Brilliant performance. Keith Moon actually died very soon after making the film. He died of a big drug overdose, and
could be suicide.
Possibly, yes. That's the end of my career, anyway.
So there's
Keith Moon, incidentally, famous for trashing hotel rooms normally, and in fact in this he just goes in and foofs around in one for a while.
Decorates her and him. Yeah.
It's ironic with him because Alice Cooper as well, the famous Killing a Live Chicken on Stage sort of performer, supposedly in the past, and with the
face makeup and big hair.
Yes, exactly. And all this horror emphasis, and he comes in this very cheesy hairdo and does a very cheesy.
Well, he's a bellboy, isn't he?
He's a bellboy,
and then he sings, as you say, a Bernie
Taupin cheesy old song. I don't really know why.
It's a song called Next Next.
Yes,
it's by somebody called Van McCoy.
Oh, okay.
But it's the subtitle of the song apparently is she's blown her chance with you, or he's blown her chance. Yes, that's right. Because it's just at the stage at the end, funnily enough. It's the last significant song in the piece. Yeah. It's, if you like, your torch song, because Sir Michael's walked out.
Van McCoy is actually in the film as well.
Yes.
I noticed. But, and again, it's one of those ones where he just gets into it with one bound, as it were,
he sits at the piano, doesn't he?
He just sort of sits about it. Never mind, Miss Manners. You don't have to worry, and do you know why? Yeah. And off we go into the song.
But it's actually a very nice tune. And he's played on... Well, no, right, but within the context of the piece, it tinkles along. It's not an Alice Cooper number, that's the point.
That's certainly true.
It's a much more middle-of-the-road
which is what had come out also the same year, actually.
And it's... and he plays it on a glass piano.
He does. I thought he was better in Wayne's World. I mean, I have to say.
Fair enough. Comparing musicals.
Yes. Sort of.
But let us take us back to Dom DeLuise, who we were both impressed by in this.
Yes.
He also gets a song, doesn't he? He gets Honey Pie.
Oh my God, he does.
For no obvious reason. And he sings it to a cutout.
Yes, he does.
A life-size cutout of Mae West.
Yes, that's true. He does. Yes, he has to. She's running him round. I mean, the premise, just about the excuse for the song, is that she's running him around and getting married and making his life much more difficult as her sort of PA. And that's right. He then starts singing the Honey Pie. Now, those of you who don't know this, because it's not a particularly well-known musical theatre song, but it is from the White Album by the Beatles. I wonder if they possibly directly negotiated the rights with Ringo Starr in this particular case. Although it's written by Paul McCartney, actually, and performed by Paul McCartney normally. And actually, it's a 20s pastiche thing. In fact, it could almost have referred to the likes of Mae West, or perhaps...
the first time round.
Yes, exactly, yeah. So I suppose in that sense it's appropriate. But he just has to do the whole routine all by himself.
Yeah, there's no one else in it.
It's the sort of song that normally in a musical you'd be singing it to the person who's caused you all the difficulties, and he just sings it to himself, as you say, to a cardboard cutout of Mae West.
But it's interesting as well, because there's so many little plot points which are sort of thrown in for one item and then thrown away. So we discover that Sir Michael Barrington's character, Sir Michael Barrington, is a spy for no obvious reason at the end.
No, that's true.
We discover that it's suggested at this moment that the PA, Dom DeLuise's character, is actually in love with Mae West.
Oh, that's right, it is, yeah.
He's suddenly, he's the Buttons character to her Cinderella,
he is,
if you like. So he leaves her room and he comes out into the foyer where the glass piano is. He then sings on his own to this cardboard cutout, suggestion being that Mae wasn't well enough to do all the scenes herself.
One suspects.
So it's a very odd piece. I didn't know the song at all.
No.
But I have to say, bearing in mind it is him just on his own and he's no Fred Astaire, he does a fairly good fist of it.
Although I have to say, the tap dancing thing, I always think is a good thing in a tap routine for the way, where the taps fall should be somewhere on the beat at all possible, or on the offbeats, but not sort of just randomly spaced in between the beginning and the end of the song.
Well, they do that lovely moment where he climbs on top of his glass piano to do a tap dance routine, and then they cut to the knees up shot.
Yes, indeed.
I have a feeling that his feet were in no way involved.
Whilst the sound of a metal hailstorm goes on. It's very strange.
Someone goes mad in a riveting factory.
Yes, in fact, I think somebody just sort of got some wrapping paper and just going next to a microphone in order to achieve that particular effect. Yes, it's a very, very strange film. And one of the sad things about it is obviously the last one that Mae West did. And Keith Moon, as we've said, and also Raft, the George Raft, and Walter Pidgeon as well. It's swan song for every last one of them, and
a pigeon song for one of them.
A pigeon song, in my case, yes, exactly. Which is a shame, really, because obviously it's awful. And, who wants to have that as their last credit?
Yeah, well, you see, I'm much warmer to it than a lot of people. But there's one song we haven't touched on yet. And incidentally, we ought to mention, on the Happy Birthday Suite 21/16, there's also the choir invisible.
Oh, yes.
Mae West is singing it. And and bearing in mind, she's the only woman in a room full of scantily clad, naked muscle men.
Yes.
As she's singing Happy Birthday 21, there's a backing chorus of clearly recorded female singers who were clearly not in the room. But there's one song we haven't mentioned, which is the Tony Curtis song.
Oh, yes.
Which is After You've Gone, which is a famous 1920s standard.
Just sort of lands in that scene.
And he's doing it with a very lovely Russian accent.
We don't really know why that song happens. I don't know why any of it happened. But
he's still... this is actually plot relevant. Pay attention with your notebooks here. His character is refusing to agree to the peace conference proposals. He's the only one still saying niet when everyone else is saying yes. Mm-hmm. And he's only prepared to say yes. He's prepared to cut a deal with the CIA to give them a yes if he can spend one more night with his former wife, with whom he's still in love.
That's right,
Marlo Manners.
Yes.
And she's in the hotel.
Yes.
So when so she reluctantly agrees for America, for old glory.
Yes.
And so she slowly walks into his room, very slowly, and he's in there.
Sits down. She manages to sit down, actually.
She does.
Without any obvious ill effects.
We never see her stand up again, though.
No.
Anyway, and so Tony Curtis is waiting for her. He's left the conference in order to have his night of passion, or so he hopes. And, of course, he sings After You've Gone and Left Me Crying. So it's a song of lamentation, but he's no longer... her husband. So, in fact, it's very real.
Yeah. Nice.
Some thought.
And he throws the champagne glasses out. That's his sort of shtick, isn't it?
He pours 2 glasses of champagne. It looks like he's about to give her one, and then he drinks both and throws them away.
As it were, yes.
Yes, as it were.
Yes, we've got some reviews here that came in shortly afterwards, in case anybody was in suspense after having seen the film as to whether the critics would agree.
Would love it.
It was terrible. They didn't, is the short answer. It's described in the following terms.
Caustic?
For example, yes, caustic as well. For example, a fiasco in which the poor audience is treated to the distressing sight in which the bloated, semi-automated corpse of Mae West waddles around a film that is equal parts a bad comedy relying on jokes that were ancient even when the film star was young, and a crappy musical with songs that are cyanide to the eardrums. And I don't think he liked it, do you?
But other critics were less kind.
Exactly, yes, it's true, they were. Here's Rex Reed. Most pathetic is seeing her enter in full bridal regalia, the groom at her side. He looks 25, she looks like something they found in the basement of a pyramid. Do you want to do one?
Yes, please. There's a very...
go on, there's
actually there's a really unpleasant line, actually. I think this is Rex Reed, who was a famous... caustic critic in America, and he's quoting on one of the laugh lines, so it's the one we mentioned already. How do you like it in London? She says, I like it anywhere. She drools, her left eye taking a look at her right eye, because she has a slightly lazy eye, unfortunately. Well, she is 84, for goodness sake.
He continues, the music starts and Mae has to clear out of the way, manoeuvring with the agility of an ocean liner in a fish pond as the lobby bursts into Hollywood.
That's hooray for Hollywood.
We also have it from Vincent Canby, who was the New York Times film reviewer. Sextette is a disorientating freak show. It is a poetic, terrifying reminder of how a virtually disembodied ego can survive total physical decay and loss of common sense. The character we see in this peculiar film looks less like the Mae West one remembers from even Myra Breckenridge,
which is the last film she made about 5 years ago,
indeed,
10 years ago,
than like a plump sheep that's been stood on its hind legs, dressed in a drag queen's idea of chic, bewigged and then smeared with pink plaster. The creature inside this get-up seems game, but arthritic and perplexed. And then, finally, another review. The creepiest monster movie of the year to date must certainly be Sextette, in which we are presented with the bizarre sight of the 87-year-old, seemingly arthritic Mae West tottering around as she mouths some of the better-known one-liners and pretends to be the kind of sex object that drives men to suicide. When Mae was a kid, in her 40s, say, one could say that she was parodying sex. When she's in her 80s, the spectacle suggests some kinky variation on necrophilia.
They weren't very nice,
They didn't
were
hold
they,
back,
children?
did they? They didn't spare her feelings. And she didn't live a lot longer, did she?
No, it was 2 years.
It was
she
just another
died
2
in
years.
1980.
Yes, so I fear that...
But
this was a sad...
it was good for her ego, because one of the nice things about it is that on the opening night, all her, say, young fans came out in droves.
Oh,
and
right,
actually,
okay.
she felt really loved. So although the reviews were absolutely appalling,
There she was.
she thought that the real people...
In a haze of temazepam.
Well, no, but in a way, I think that's nice, because that, in a way...
Yes.
Let's face it, at the end of the day, we are still talking about it 30 years later.
When someone makes the biopic of Mae West, if they haven't done so already, and I'm sure there'll be another anyway, of course they'll be able to do this. They'll be able to flash back from that one night where she is, like, arthritic old lady, and into her glory days, I imagine.
Isn't it called Iron Lady?
Oh, yes.
Meryl Streep.
Oh, yes. Actually, there are some interesting parallels, aren't there? I wonder if Mrs. Thatcher's considered doing a musical at this stage of her existence. I think she could be jolly good.
There are, it ought to be said, a couple of continuity errors.
Right.
We've already mentioned the tapping on the carpet.
Yes.
There's a very visible microphone in one scene,
Right.
in the hotel gymnasium where the javelin player is. But the best one, of course, is that for... Sir Michael Barrington decides he's got to retrieve the cassette, which by now is stuck in the gargoyle's mouth on the very top of the building.
This lion we mentioned earlier.
So we get all this Darings Do stuff,
Yeah.
where he clings to the side of the building and looks down every now and then at the street below, cuts to stock footage of cars travelling on a London road. However, once he's got the cassette, instead of climbing back up again, he decides to jump from where he is.
He does, that's right.
Through a window, where he then lands on the trampoline. And then
That's how he gets up there as well, don't forget.
But the problem is there's a continuity error between the cut to his instant possible death if he were to fall because it's a street.
Yes.
And in fact, actually in front of him must be the skylight to a lower gymnasium.
Oh, yes, that's true, yes.
On the trampoline. Yes.
Oh, well,
it's all very minor stuff, but it's...
yes, and pales into insignificance next to the entire massive folly that the film itself is. Indeed. Well, it's a very fun movie. What is there anything else we need to cover before we...
Well, just a couple of things. I just a few resonances. When you study Mae West a bit, you discover a few things. Now, we mentioned Ian Whitcomb as the man who rewrote some of the lyrics to Happy Birthday 16. Of course, the rhyme for 21 is different from 16.
Yes.
So he has to come up with a splendid line. You're the biggest boy under the sun. Happy birthday 21.
Gracious.
But Ian Whitcomb, as I say, wrote one great pop hit of the 1960s, which was called You Turn Me On.
Right.
It's a mod classic, actually, it's considered to be. But he wrote lots of other songs. There's one called Nervous as well. Now, did you know that when Mae West was a mere 72, she became the oldest woman to ever have a solo album on the Billboard Hot 200 chart.
Wow.
A record that was kept until until 2011, when Wanda Jackson beat her at 73 with The Party's Not Over.
Oh, okay.
So that record lasted nearly 30 years.
That's pretty good
very
going,
impressive.
Yes. Can't argue with
and
that.
this album was called... It's a rock and roll album. It's called Way Out West.
Oh, yes.
There we are. And they're covers of pop songs. Now, this is Mae West always looking to the future and not looking back, although she reuses her old material. This is 10 covers. So you've got Treat Him Right, When a Man Loves a Woman, Shaking All Over, Bob Dylan's If You Got to Go. You've got Day Tripper, another Beatles number. There's Twist and Shout, which was clearly beyond her abilities at that stage.
Although presumably if she did one, she had to do the other, one imagines.
Later on in the 1970s, she recorded another album called Great Balls of Fire, and she covered The Doors.
Wow.
And she had one further album.
I'm starting to agree with this reviewer about the disembodied ego thing.
She did a Christmas collection of...
it's frankly Shatner-esque echoes in all of this, I think,
yeah. But she was still doing it. But what I think is interesting, that she was covering contemporary songs. So
Yes.
she was trying to be of the time. She did an album called Wild Christmas in the late 1960s.
I think we should seriously be getting hold of these albums. I would actually like to hear her doing Twist and Shout and just see how it sounds.
How long we last.
Yes.
And she also, at the Academy Award ceremony in 1958, so she was still merely in her 60s,
yes.
She sang Baby It's Cold Outside by Frank Lesser with Rock Hudson, of all people.
That I can...
Yeah, that's
that,
a camp
that
masterpiece, but in 1958 no one would have realised or appreciated it. But the thing about it is, on this album, with Bob Dylan and the Beatles and John Lee Hooker and all these people... there are 2 songs by Ian Whitcomb.
Right.
And Ian Whitcomb is the man who's also brought in to write the lyrics of the song. So there's a connection there. I think that's clear. The other thing about it we've said is that the gymnastics thing, where she's surrounded by...
muscly men.
Well, they start off in vests and they all end up in sort of American Stars and Stripes posing.
Yes, sort of thing, yes.
Well, posing trunks, really.
Yep.
They're all muscle men except for the 21-year-old. Now, I think I mentioned that she had a brief fling with the black chap for whom she bought the building. Well, his name was William Jones, and he was a boxing champ in the old-style big-chested boxing. His real name, he went under the performance of Gorilla Jones, and they had an affair. But actually, Mae West found her long-lasting true love when she was 61.
Right.
She genuinely was a sexually active woman into her late life.
Yeah.
When she became romantically involved with one of the muscle men, he was a Mr. California, who she'd hired to provide beefcake in her Las Vegas shows, her live shows.
Oh, okay.
So at 61, she was doing these sort of Las Vegas shows,
makes sense, yeah.
glitz. She had naked or near naked men glistening up, and she fell for one. And his name was Chester Rybonsky. Changed his name to Paul Novak rather later on.
Oh, right.
And she was 30 years older than he was, so he must have been 31 at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And they moved in with each other, and they stayed together until she died at 87 in 1980.
Oh, that's nice to know.
So what I like about it, first of all, it's a good, successful relationship. But secondly, it goes to show that she had the muscle man part, because that's not a look that people find attractive anymore. That's a much older. The broad chest thing is a much more. Yeah, but it used to be ubiquitous as the figure of male beauty in the 50s. Yeah. By this stage, it was dying out, so it's a little bit backwards, as it were. But she had this taste. She used it on her stage show, and she clearly incorporated that into. This team doesn't look anything like a gymnastics team, and they've some of them have got that 80s and 70s look of having moustaches, which looks very retrospectively gay now.
Yes.
So there are interesting resonances with other things that were going on in her life at the time, which seem to have been interpolated. And as she wrote the screenplay...
Well, I was going to say, she co-wrote it, didn't she? And
she wrote the play, and then, it was adapted into a film.
As a screenplay. Well, there we are. That's Sextette for you, and what an extraordinary piece of work it is. What I do recommend is, of course, one can only communicate so much about it by talking about it. What you can find, I understand, Your Honour, is that there are clips of it. Some are up on YouTube, and should you desire to experience either Babyface or Timothy Dalton singing
Love Will Keep Us Together,
a Captain and Tennille hit, exactly, by Neil Sedaka, then yes, that's something that, well, I can't recommend it enough. It'll put a smile on it'll put a smile on your face, and if it doesn't, you have a heart of stone.
Do we want to finish with the final sexual innuendo laugh line of the piece?
Well, it's not so much of an innuendo, really, is it? As a sort of sample entendre.
It is just the one entendre.
He's there on his yacht, isn't he?
He's
having
stormed
left.
off.
Yes, and then he says he's singing sort of fitfully, as it were, or
Love Will Keep Us
Love
Together,
will keep us together,
to a photograph
exactly.
of her.
Desultorily, I suppose, is what I mean. And then she happens to be just perched on the bed, presumably
somehow
put there by a forklift truck shortly beforehand. They started filming
through the cargo hold on ropes,
and he hears her voice, and he's finally ready to leap into the bed with her. Something we thankfully don't see, as I suspect it would have resulted in several fractures. And
he makes a reference to Paul Revere.
That's right.
Who warned the American rebel troops at the British Army's approach.
Very famous for being quite quick. And she says, "The British are coming.
I look forward to being able to say
Yes, that's right. The British are coming, that's right. And they roll the credits and the whole thing
collapses under its own weight.
Exactly. And that's Sextette. And as Musical Talk's latest episode does exactly the same thing, I have to thank you very much, Thos Ribbits, for joining me.
It's a pleasure. I've enjoyed both the Tete and the sex.
Yes, indeed. And I thank... Good grief. And I would like to thank myself for sticking through to the end of this episode. And I'd like to thank you, dear listener, for doing the same. That is all from Musical Talk this week. We may see you again, hopefully. Goodbye.
Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk edited by Thos Ribbits and presented by Thos Ribbits and Tim Saywood. Copyright Musical Talk 2020. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on iTunes and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can at Musical Talk Thos.
Hello.